So it seems the latest right-wing cause is to secure a presidential pardon for Derek Chauvin.
Well, I think the reason that I'm advocating for the pardon is because Derek Chauvin is not guilty.
Republicans truly have the interests of the common people in mind. Elon Musk thinks we should think about this too, but I don't know, I think he should maybe spend his mental energy elsewhere. But how did we get here? Why are some of today's most powerful media figures working to exonerate a man who abused his power as a police officer to commit murder? Well, I have three possible reasons for you. The first, specifically for Ben Shapiro, is that his media company, the Daily Wire, is having a bit of a hard time right now. I think he's jumping on the bandwagon, talking about an attention-grabbing and popular right-wing issue to see if he can get some attention. Unfortunately, it's clear that he doesn't really care much or know much about the Derek Chauvin trial. He doesn't even know how to pronounce the name of one of the 4 officers who participated in Floyd's murder.
Officers J. Alexander Kung and Thomas Lane.
That's J. Alexander King, Ben. If you'd watched the Chauvin trial since it actually happened, I'm sure you'd know that, but you haven't. You don't care about this, stop pretending, it's embarrassing. So his video isn't very interesting. It's a lot of rehashed old arguments that have already been made by other people, who we will talk about later. The second reason is also the partial cause of most of our problems right now. It's the media environment. Social media is a hellscape where people can shamelessly lie, and they don't even have to be convincing because the algorithms will feed the lies to the people most likely to believe the lies, tearing our communities into increasingly insular and radical subgroups which functionally exist in different realities, making it impossible for us to agree on anything at all. On a completely unrelated note though, you ever heard of a documentary called The Fall of Minneapolis? Or the media company which produced it? What was that called again? Oh yeah, Alpha News.
Did it dirty. No soap.
If you share my distaste for the campaign to pardon Derek Chauvin and were hoping to hear a more practical explanation for its origins than social media bad, or Ben Shapiro needs attention, here's your answer. This film and its creators are the primary and final reason why many conservatives now believe Derek Chauvin is innocent. The film's apologists will tell you it shares valuable police perspectives and sheds light on the 2020 Minneapolis riots, but anything potentially valuable within the film is undercut by its main goal, erasing George Floyd's murder and establishing that Derek Chauvin is innocent, even if they need to ignore annoying constraints like honesty or journalistic integrity. The title of my first video about this film was "The Fall of Minneapolis is full of shameless lies." So I wasn't entirely surprised when Alpha News itself, along with the film's producer Liz Collin and director J.C. Shea, were sued for defamation in October of 2024. Because the film has effectively erased George Floyd's murder within the minds of millions of Americans, you might expect that George Floyd's family is behind the lawsuit, but no, it's actually Katie Blackwell. She's been a Minneapolis police officer for the entirety of her career, starting as a community response officer and recently becoming the assistant chief of police. I thought Alpha News was sort of an advocate for the Minneapolis police. You'd think they'd like her, but no, I guess not. Wait, you're telling me she's also a 27-year veteran of the Army National Guard? Not only that, but I'm reading that she received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for her service. Oh, and she's an ordained minister who provides free weddings for the homeless. As far as any reasonable person should be able to tell, this is an impressive, upstanding, accomplished individual. Despite all she's experienced during decades-long careers in policing and the military, Blackwell reports in her affidavit that fulfilling her responsibility to testify truthfully during the state and federal trials of Derek Chauvin was the most difficult time in her professional life. She says, "I would have preferred going back to Iraq and redoing the over 160 combat missions, ambushes, and IED attacks, and suffering again through all the fear, pain, and anguish I experienced in those situations, rather than go through what I knew would put me in a position of being subjected to the criticism of many of my peers for violating the golden unwritten rule of policing. Cops do not snitch on cops." Blackwell knew she had to do the right thing, to testify honestly in Chauvin's trial, and she did, all the while knowing retribution would come from those who defend the policing status quo at all costs. And just as she feared, retribution arrived. Liz Collins' book, titled "They're Lying: The Media, the Left, and the Death of George Floyd," was released in 2022. The book was adapted into The Fall of Minneapolis in 2023, and both works portray Blackwell as having committed perjury during Chauvin's trial. Blackwell didn't lie, but given the immense popularity of the film online with 10 million views across all platforms, and within the communities in which she lives and works. She lives as though she did lie every day. So that's why she sued Alpha News. However, it's really hard for a public figure to win a defamation lawsuit against the media, so the lawsuit was dismissed. Now, not defamatory and truthful are completely different things. Blackwell couldn't establish that Alpha News acted with actual malice when they were talking about her, so the lawsuit failed. But the film misled millions of people in my community and smeared a war hero and dedicated Minneapolis police officer for no good reason. This is the story of how a small media company threw good cops and war heroes under the bus and misled millions of ordinary Americans just for a little attention and to launder the reputation of Derek Chauvin. I'll talk about what Alpha News says about Katie Blackwell soon, but first I want to point out how incredibly influential this documentary has been. After Chauvin was convicted, some people on the right expressed disagreement, but the Fall of Minneapolis provided a centralizing force, an opportunity for the right-wing media machine to rewrite history. Most people probably don't spend much time on Rumble or watching online right-wing talk shows, but if you do, I'm sorry, you've definitely heard of the Fall of Minneapolis.
It is called The Fall of Minneapolis. It's doing very, very well. Millions and millions and millions of views.
An extraordinary new documentary called The Fall of Minneapolis.
The Fall of Minneapolis.
The Fall of Minneapolis.
The Fall of Minneapolis. It raises a million questions.
The Fall of Minneapolis
seeks to dispel the mainstream narrative surrounding George Floyd's death in Minneapolis and police officer Derek Chauvin's trial.
It is transforming or recasting the whole way that we see George Floyd, BLM, and what in retrospect appears to have been almost a kind of show trial in Minneapolis.
Absolutely, I think you're right.
It is Liz Collins, the producer of The Fall of Minneapolis.
We are now joined by Liz Collins, the journalist behind it.
Liz Collins, journalist at Alpha News, and J.C. Shea, former police officer and editor of Liz's best-selling book. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Here now, Liz Collins. She's an award-winning investigative reporter and producer of The Fall of Minneapolis. So, how badly were the American people lied to?
Liz, welcome to On Watch.
The Fall of Minneapolis.
Fall of a once great city here in the Midwest, in Minneapolis. Just the fall of Minneapolis.
Extremely misleading.
We need to do a much more vigorous, comprehensive job.
The filmmakers were dishonest in their depiction of the situation.
Like and subscribe. Oh goodness, sorry, not sure what happened there. Anyway, so yes, the filmmakers had an extensive media tour and talked to all of my favorite people. The film's influence doesn't stop there, though. Coleman Hughes wrote 2 long articles arguing Chauvin was wrongfully convicted. Fake journalist Tyler Oliveira decided to travel to Minneapolis to piggyback off the documentary's success. And most recently, of course, we have Ben Shapiro's latest embarrassing stunt, leveraging the entirety of his reputation and resources to campaign President Trump for a pardon for Derek Chauvin's federal charges. Anyway, my point is that none of these things happen without the Fall of Minneapolis. So I'm going to focus on Alpha News and the film, everything that has to do with Katie Blackwell. She's a very successful police officer and community leader. As far as I can tell, she doesn't have a history of suing anyone else for defamation, so what exactly did Alpha News say about her? Why would a police officer spend her valuable time and resources on a defamation case against the media? She's just one person. Alpha News is a pretty popular regional media company. Blackwell's side of the story is just not being heard. Alpha News is leveraging their platform to rally support, sharing their perspective, calling their fans to attend hearings.
Many of you have asked about the defamation lawsuit against myself and Alpha News and when the next legal proceeding will occur. This Friday, February 7th, our attorney will argue to have the case dismissed. Alpha News and I would sure appreciate a strong show of support and maybe help fill the seats inside the courtroom if you can. We hope you'll join us in court this Friday, February 7th at 9 a.m. at the Hennepin County Courthouse. The address is 300 South 6th Street in downtown Minneapolis. Again, it's courtroom 759. We hope you'll be there.
And even waiting for Katie Blackwell outside of her workplace to interview her about the lawsuit.
Hi, Katie. How are you? Fine. Yeah, actually, I have a few questions for you. Are you aware that 14 former and current Minneapolis police officers say you lied during Derek Chauvin's trial and perjured yourself? What's the truth here?
While mainstream outlets like the Minnesota Star-Tribune are doing a great job reporting about the trial's major events, very few people are sharing Blackwell's detailed perspective like I plan to do. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I obviously won't be trying to prove defamation. I just want to show everybody just how badly they treated Katie Blackwell in their film and share the story. It's also a great place to start if you want to learn how the people I like to call Chauvin defenders operate. Alpha News' foundational claim is that the officers were performing a restraint maneuver called the maximal restraint technique at the time of George Floyd's death. Alpha News shows the transcript of the FBI's interview with Thomas Lane, one of the officers who was convicted of aiding and abetting Chauvin, and points out that the MRT was an approved MPD technique with its own section within the Use of Force Policy Manual. Understanding the MRT is incredibly important to understanding this case, so let's start by looking at the policy manual. Where to start? Definitions. Maximal restraint technique. Technique used to secure a subject's feet to their waist in order to prevent the movement of legs and limit the possibility of property damage or injury to him, her, or others. So the MRT isn't just a technique that is a set of physical maneuvers performed on a subject, but it's a technique performed with a purpose, securing a subject's feet to their waist. This combination of technique and purpose is pretty standard for police use of force. Police officers are bound by the Fourth Amendment's reasonableness standard, meaning that they're only supposed to use the amount of force that is objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances known to that employee at that time. And of course, the force used shall be consistent with all of their training. That's not me talking, that's the MPD training manual again. This time it's the very beginning of the training manual. So what we'd probably expect to see if the officers were following training is that they bring George Floyd to the ground, they bind his feet to his waist in accordance with the whole point of the MRT, and then they release him from the hold when appropriate. So let's look at the officers' actions. They initially brought George Floyd to the ground when they attempted to put him into the back of the police car. He didn't cooperate, started to struggle, and was pulled through the police car and brought to the ground on the other side. Officer Lane says, "Let's take him out and MRE," when he meant MRT. The officers then start to search for their hobble devices, which are restraints used to perform the MRT. Based on these initial actions, we can surely all agree that it seems the officers intended to perform the MRT when they first brought a handcuffed George Floyd to the ground. Unfortunately, the officers abandoned their search for their hobble devices. And as former Officer Thomas Lane reported in his interview with the FBI, they decided to just kind of pin him there while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. The weight of all three officers pressed a handcuffed George Floyd face down against the asphalt for 9.5 minutes, while he and a crowd of bystanders begged them to let him go. During Chauvin's trial, world-renowned pulmonologist Dr. Martin Tobin explained that Floyd was unable to take deep breaths because officers held him handcuffed in the prone or face down position, with their knees on his side and back. Deep breaths allow oxygen to reach the alveoli, where it transfers into the bloodstream, but the weight on Floyd's torso prevented him from fully expanding his lungs. As a result, he was forced to take increasingly shallow breaths, causing a dangerous drop in oxygen levels.
Okay, so now we're looking, and you can see the contraction of the diaphragm. That's the kind of pink area down at the bottom. We see air going down through the windpipe and then proceeding down to the bronchial tubes. And then it was going to continue down the bronchial tubes until it will reach out to the air sacs, which will be the alveoli. And now we're seeing that we're moving down here, and these are like the grape-like structures down at the bottom, and this is where all the action occurs. The oxygen goes across those air sacs, and also the CO2 goes across them, then it's expelled back out.
What happened in the case of Mr. Floyd that relates to the shallow breathing that resulted in his low oxygen?
So there are a number of forces that led to that the size of his breath became so small. And so there are a series of forces higher up that are leading to that. And the main forces that are going to lead to the shallow breath are going to be that he's turned prone on the street, that he has the handcuffs in place combined with the street, and then that he has a knee on his neck, and then that he has a knee on his back and on his side. All of these four forces are ultimately going to result in the low tidal volume, which gives you the shallow breaths that we saw here. And so the air will not be able to reach those air sacs we just saw in the video where the oxygen is exchanged and the carbon dioxide is removed.
Doctor, is there a concept that in the respiratory medicine field known as dead space?
Yes, there is.
How does that relate to Mr. Floyd?
So if you think of the video back all the way until you saw those clusters of grapes, where you saw the blood vessels surrounding the alveoli, everything up to there is dead space. So as you're breathing in, you breathe in through your nose, your mouth goes down through your windpipe, down through the bronchial tubes, radiating out until it reaches the air sacs. Up till you get to the air sacs, it's all dead space, because the reason we call it is because no oxygen can get across those bronchial tubes. No carbon dioxide can get across it. The oxygen and the carbon dioxide, the only place that gets across is those little grape-like structures. So everything in the lungs before that is dead space.
The officer's prolonged restraint further restricted Floyd's ability to contract his diaphragm and expand his chest, worsening his oxygen deprivation and leading to cardiac arrest. Officer Lane suggested rolling Floyd onto his side, the recovery position, but Chauvin refused. After several minutes of constant restraint with no resistance from Floyd, Officer King informed Chauvin that Floyd no longer had a pulse, but Chauvin did not move, did not prompt the other less experienced officers to act, did not start CPR or provide medical care, and maintained his position on Floyd's neck for minutes longer until paramedics finally arrived. So, is that the maximal restraint technique? Somehow I don't think that's what I'll find in the Minneapolis Police Department training manual. Here's MPD Use of Force Policy Section 5-316, which governs the MRT. If you're one of those crazy people who starts reading at the beginning of a document, you may have noticed the first red flag. The purpose is to establish a policy on hobble restraint devices, but the officers never used a hobble device on George Floyd. Remember the definition of MRT we read earlier? Technique to secure feet to waist? Well, the officers never secured Floyd's feet to his waist, which is the only reason you'd perform the MRT. And remember, all police force needs to be objectively reasonable. When you check the use section of this policy, which outlines how MRT is actually performed, you'll see that 2 hobble devices are required. The officers, again, used none. Minneapolis Police Department training confirms this. Here's a training slide I found that describes the MRT steps exactly as they appear in the policy. The hobble device is such an essential part of MRT that officers often just call it the hobble. In fact, Officer Lane, in the very FBI interview Alpha News features in the Fall of Minneapolis, calls MRT the hobble. Right here, you can see it on screen in the film. Look. Well, considering Lane, King, and Chauvin performed exactly 0 steps of the maximal restraint technique, I think it's safe to say that they did not perform the maximal restraint technique, or at least they didn't perform it how you're supposed to. They thought about it, they started it, and then they gave up. For George Floyd, this means, as Thomas Lane said, they just kind of held him there. Thomas Smith of the Serious Inquiries Only podcast captured this perfectly with an analogy. If a priest dunks you underwater and then holds you there until you drown, would you still call that a baptism? Yes, Alpha News bravely declares. Sounds like a textbook baptism to me. Remember, Alpha News claims that the officers were just following their training and following the procedure. It's a bizarre claim, considering Liz Collins' book and the Fall of Minneapolis both show the full MRT procedure I showed you. How could they miss the definition and the use section? Remember the training slide describing the steps of the MRT I showed you earlier? I took that picture, myself, straight from Liz Collins' book, page 211. Every piece of information I've given you suggesting that the officers didn't perform the MRT as trained, Alpha News already knew, they just ignored it. Speaking of Liz Collins' book, it gives a much clearer picture of their creative interpretation of MRT policy. Collin points out a couple lines where it says, as soon as reasonably possible, any person restrained using the MRT who is in the prone position shall be placed in the following positions based on the type of restraint used. If the hobble restraint is used, the person shall be placed in the side recovery position. And of course, she claims that there's an issue here, incredulously asking, well, what are they supposed to do if the officers don't use a hobble device? As if we can't all drag our eyeballs 3 inches up the page and read that every single step of the MRT requires a hobble device. If we were discussing a handcuffing technique instead of MRT, would Colin claim the policy is incomplete because it doesn't describe how to perform it without using handcuffs? Colin also missed the fact that this is a line within the safety section of the policy, not the use section, which actually describes how the technique is performed. Thanks to Radley Balco, an investigative journalist who wrote an incredible takedown of the Fall of Minneapolis and cited my first video, thank you Mr. Balco, we know why the policy is structured this way. An older version used to allow another kind of restraint, the wrap, and they deleted that option from the safety section without changing the phrasing of the section header, which seems to precede a list of possible restraints. Even without that context, though, it just doesn't make any sense to claim Chauvin, King, and Lane were performing the MRT. It's indefensible, which is why it's my opinion that Alpha News is either being dishonest or they're so committed to their own narrative that they're detached from reality. I know that was a lot of detail, but I hope you see why it was important. Now that I've thoroughly discussed the MRT, we'll be able to talk about the rest of Alpha News' claims about Katie Blackwell a lot more easily. The film moves on to other topics for a couple minutes, and then they arrive at Blackwell's testimony, showing the following clip.
I'd like to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. Is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
Okay. And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right.
Yeah.
Immediately after that clip, former MPD Chief Arredondo is then shown saying the exact same thing.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Then they cut to the interview between Colin and Derek Chauvin's mother, Carolyn Palenti, where Colin says that
several of those witnesses testified that MRT, or the maximal restraint technique, was not a part of Minneapolis police policy.
Which is a clear reference to and characterization of the clips we just saw of Blackwell and Arredondo's testimony. Colin asserts that Blackwell testified that the MRT was not a part of Minneapolis police policy, that she recognized the MRT, understood it as the MRT, and in saying that she did not recognize it, lied. It's already a ridiculous framing of Blackwell's testimony, because you have to accept that the officers were doing a recognizable version of the MRT. As we've established, they weren't. As a consequence, Blackwell does not see the MRT when she looks at Exhibit 17. Now, how do I know what Blackwell is thinking here? Alpha News' edit removes a sentence in which Blackwell explicitly identifies Exhibit 17 as an improvised neck restraint, a completely different technique from the MRT. To make it even clearer how they plucked a sentence out of the testimony in a completely deceptive way, let's look at the original unedited clip of Blackwell's testimony side by side with the Fall of Minneapolis' version.
Is this a trained technique that's by the Minneapolis Police Department when you were overseeing the training unit?
It is not.
And why not?
Well, use of force according to policy has to be, consistent with MPD training. And what we train are neck restraints, the conscious and unconscious neck restraint. So per policy, a neck restraint is compressing one or both sides of the neck using an arm or leg. But what we train is using one arm or two arm to do a neck restraint.
And how does this differ?
I don't know what kind of improvised position that is. So that's not what we train.
All right.
Yeah.
Remember how Liz Collin told Chauvin's mother, referencing Blackwell's testimony, that several of the witnesses testified that MRT was not a part of Minneapolis police policy? Well, that's a lie. Collin had to surgically remove one specific answer where Blackwell confirms that she's not seeing the MRT at all. She describes Exhibit 17 as depicting a neck restraint, and describes why the neck restraint we see wasn't aligned with MPD training. She never said anything close to MRT is not a part of Minneapolis police policy. And when Colin claims that she did, she's falsely portraying Blackwell as having committed perjury during one of the most high-profile trials of the century. What's more, it almost seems like they strategically disguised their editing. You see how Exhibit 17 was placed on the screen over the edits to Blackwell's testimony, and how they sequenced the cuts so Blackwell's answer to the prosecutor's first question leads right into the prosecutor's last question? The audience is clearly not supposed to know that there was a cut here. Luckily though, this is where the dishonesty stops. The Fall of Minneapolis makes only good points for the rest of the runtime, and I actually learned a lot from watching the rest of the film. Just kidding, we won't even make it 30 more seconds before the dynamic duo of Liz Collin and Derek Chauvin's mother tell another lie. Oh, wait, sorry. 30 seconds isn't exactly right. It's actually 0 seconds. It's the very next sentence in the film that starts the next lie. Sorry about that.
Several of those witnesses testified that MRT, or the maximal restraint technique, was not a part of Minneapolis police policy.
Oh, it wasn't part of the training. The pages that didn't want to be presented in court because they weren't in the manual. I've seen the manual. I've read through the manuals. I've seen them. They're not in the manuals? Well, they sure as hell are in Derek's training manuals. So how can they say that they don't exist?
That's Derek's manual.
These are Derek's training manuals.
And MRT is in there?
Yes.
No!
It's in there.
It's not in there! As you might have guessed, that's not the MRT. So let's recap here. Derek Chauvin's mom brought her son's original training manuals to the interview and holds them up to the camera. Colin asks, MRT is in there? And Paulenti says, yes, it's in there. And then this photo you see now from the training manual is placed on the screen. It looks pretty similar to what we see Derek Chauvin doing in Exhibit 17, so obviously they're the same thing, right? Well, no, obviously it's not necessarily true that they're the same thing. Alpha News and their goons have seemingly not reached the stage of human development where you realize that two things which look similar can actually be different things. In fact, I'm here to tell you that it's impossible, literally impossible, that these two pictures depict the same technique. The photo from the training manual shows the third step in a handcuffing maneuver called the pump turnover. In Exhibit 17, George Floyd was already handcuffed, so there's no way Chauvin was employing a handcuffing technique. What's worse, it's impossible for that photo to depict the MRT. Let's go back to the MRT policy. It's clear that maximal restraint technique can only be carried out on suspects who are already handcuffed. So one picture depicts a handcuffing technique, the other picture depicts a technique that you can only use on a subject who's already in handcuffs. These are mutually exclusive and completely different maneuvers. But Alpha News doesn't care about any of these annoying details. They're happy to claim that Exhibit 17, the MRT, and the pump turnover are all just the same thing because they look kind of similar in the pictures. Nice. Excellent journalism, Liz Collin. I want to be clear though, this isn't just them being careless. As you might be able to tell, I've thought about this a lot, and I'm having a really hard time coming to any conclusion other than the idea that they intentionally misrepresented the original training manual. Remember when Colin asks, MRT is in there? And Paulenti says, yes, it's in there. Then they show the picture of the pump turnover from the manual on screen. They unambiguously call the tactic depicted here the MRT. Now you might notice that the photo in the film is unlabeled, and wonder how I knew that it was a handcuffing technique. Well, I've been looking for that training manual online for more than a year, because I had a hunch they weren't representing it accurately in the film. My suspicions were confirmed when, thanks to Blackwell's lawsuit, Colin released the full manual to the court as a supporting document to her affidavit, which is how we all know now that this photo does not depict the MRT. In the original manual, there's text under this picture, which reads, from a kneeling power stance, the officer controls the subject using a wrist lock or arm bar. He can now proceed with ease to handcuffing. This text makes clear that the image above does not depict the MRT because, as I mentioned before, the MRT can only be used on already handcuffed individuals. Plus, there's the fact that it's not called the MRT, it's called the pump turnover, not the MRT. Different title, different name, different thing. Come on, Alpha News, what are you doing? Alpha News showed the picture, presented it as if it were the MRT, and blurred the original text. Here are screenshots from the documentary and the original training manual. You can clearly see how Alpha News obscured the text when they displayed the photo from the manual on the screen in the documentary because they knew it would expose their lie if it remained. They then proceed to say that MRT is in the training manual, when it's not. I've linked it below. They know full well that they're displaying a completely different technique. Yikes. Not a good look for people who claim that their dedication to uncovering the truth is persistent and unwavering. Before we go forward, I need to clarify that Alpha News' argument has always been, up until the exact point at which they were sued, of course, that Floyd's arresting officers were specifically performing a textbook example of the MRT, not a neck restraint. They smear Blackwell solely on this basis. Blackwell should have recognized the MRT, but instead called Chauvin's technique an improvised neck restraint. So she lied. We know this because they posted as much on their website in mid-June of 2024. In the context of the defamation lawsuit, Alpha News' lawyer has essentially abandoned their original claim that Blackwell should have recognized Exhibit 17 as the MRT. Instead, they now emphasize that MPD officers, including Blackwell herself, have previously trained and used knee on neck and knee on upper back restraints. They're spreading this photo of Blackwell performing an arrest because, again, they're happy to claim that two techniques which look similar must be the same thing, even when they aren't. The fact that I just explained two mutually exclusive maneuvers, both of which feature knee on neck restraints, shows that putting a knee on a subject's neck is a feature of many different maneuvers police can use, again, only if the circumstances make it reasonable for them to do so. The real issue has never been simply that Chauvin put his knee on Floyd's neck. The real issue is that Chauvin kept his knee there for 9.5 minutes, long after Floyd had stopped resisting, stopped breathing, and even after his heart stopped beating. Chauvin was required by policy to de-escalate his use of force and provide medical care, but he did not do so, even as his fellow officers suggested rolling Floyd to his side and advised that Floyd's heart was no longer beating. Chauvin maintained his hold. If Blackwell had handcuffed this subject, called over 2 other officers to pin him down, and remained on his back for 9.5 minutes while he slowly died, only then could we meaningfully compare her actions here to Derek Chauvin's. Since she simply arrested the suspect without murdering him instead, these two photos have nothing meaningful in common, just a superficial similarity and a cynical attempt to falsely equate them. Let's get back to the Fall of Minneapolis. We're almost done with what they say about Katie Blackwell. Colin interviews Derek Chauvin himself and says,
During the trial, several witnesses, including Chief Arredondo and Inspector Blackwell, testified that they didn't recognize the technique you and the other officers were using, as if it was not a part of Minneapolis police training, but was MRT, the maximal restraint technique, part of training and policy.
What a question, huh? As we've already established, Blackwell and Arredondo never testified that MRT wasn't a part of training, and Chauvin and the other officers weren't performing the MRT. Chauvin, of course, doesn't share my distaste for Colin's misrepresentation. Instead, he quite eagerly replies,
Absolutely. In fact, I'm looking at it right now. 5-316, maximal restraint technique, right in their written policy manual.
And they then highlight a line in the MRT policy which states that officers shall monitor the restrained subject until the arrival of medical personnel. And I just have to ask, what exactly is their point here? Are they suggesting that kneeling on an unconscious man for minutes after his heart stopped was monitoring him? Was that supposed to include starting chest compressions? I know. Did Colin mistake the word monitor for murder? That would actually explain a lot. Colin then asked Chauvin about an MRT training photo.
Your attorney wanted to show a photo of MRT to the jury, but Judge Cahill denied it. Was this a key piece of evidence?
I think it certainly is important. Just the fact that it's a PowerPoint training presentation that the City of Minneapolis Police Department delivered, using that photograph that at least illustrates some of the training techniques that are performed.
I agree. Not completely, of course. I agree that this photo is an important tool we can use to learn about the MRT, but not that it should have been admitted into Chauvin's trial as evidence. After all, Chauvin couldn't ever demonstrate that he saw this slide or participated in a training where the slide was used, which is why Judge Cahill excluded it. The Court of Appeals agreed with Cahill's exclusion, and noted that the text on the slide warns about the dangers of positional asphyxia when performing the MRT, which, and I quote, would have further shown that Chauvin failed to follow the MPD training and used unreasonable force. Yes, it's not just a photo, it's a training slide, and the slide's text actively undermines Chauvin's case. So of course, Liz Collin conveniently calls it a photo instead, and Alpha News, unsurprisingly, breezes past the content of the slide and never tells the audience why it was excluded from the trial in the first place. See, let's reverse the footage and then we'll pause and you can see the text on the screen. They sure moved pretty quickly past all that, didn't they, huh? Alpha News never engages with the arguments presented by the 3-judge panel that denied Derek Chauvin's appeal. They do, however, completely ignore all of their arguments and interview Derek Chauvin's appeal lawyer, who says the following.
What I've seen of the videotape, what was done at the scene with George Floyd and the photograph in the police training manual, they look pretty identical.
Good lord, they look pretty identical. Apparently it's around age 5 when children begin to develop the ability to understand that even two things which look similar can have different identities. You might be noticing that I've made this point multiple times, and that's because this mistake is a theme with Chauvin defenders. And no, I don't think they're all suffering from a rare developmental disorder. I think they're just trying to defend the indefensible using horrible arguments. And it's embarrassing. Anyway, that's about everything relevant to Katie Blackwell within the Fall of Minneapolis. I made this video not just because I want to draw more attention to her lawsuit, but also because I wanted to demonstrate how bad and dishonest these arguments are. Other common points used to delegitimize the Chauvin verdict about George Floyd's drug use or jury bias, the autopsy report, countless others, are equally ridiculous. I'll talk more about those later in the video and in future videos, so subscribe. But right now, it's time to be mean. I pointed out a couple minutes ago that it'd be embarrassing to be a Chauvin defender, and I want to clarify that it's not embarrassing or bad to ask questions about the trial or to have believed people who lied about it. Case in point are Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. They're both well-respected academics who, to my horror, initially praised the Fall of Minneapolis without question.
How dare I even begin to think critically about whether or not it's appropriate to say what happened to George Floyd was murder.
Derek Chauvin didn't kill that man. I never thought I'd be saying that. But it appears to be true. Are we missing anything?
Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison would soon contact Lowry and McWhorter and inform them that they were in fact missing something. Lowry and McWhorter would soon invite Collin and Shea onto their show. It didn't go well for them.
When Ellison wrote us with his, polite scorn, here's what really happened.
Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota.
Both of us went and looked at the whole report of that pulmonologist. Both of us watched it. I certainly watched the whole thing.
This is Attorney General Keith Ellison. Dr. Lowry, I urge you to listen to the testimony of Dr. Tobin to see exactly why and how Chauvin, King, and Lane killed Floyd.
And it worried us so much that we called those two people on. That's when we called them on. We asked them questions. By the end of it, we were not saying, we were right. At least I certainly wasn't saying it or thinking it. There was kind of a big question mark by the end of it.
Dr. Martin Tobin is a medical expert on respiratory mechanics who testified, I did listen to his testimony, that Floyd died from a restriction of his access to air because of the positioning that he was being held in with handcuffs against the ground.
It's interesting, might be relevant, but again, it doesn't account for everything that happened. How would he explain George Floyd saying, I can't choke, I can't breathe, nobody's on top of him? That testimony fails to account for that. Something was already happening before the proverbial knee on the neck incident even began.
MRT is not unheard of, but Chauvin was not using it right, is the issue. Many people have leaned on the shoulder, which maybe extends into the neck of people. The idea is to only use it quickly, like for say 30 seconds, as preparation to getting somebody into this hobble, not to just hold them there on the street for minutes and minutes and minutes. But they did not say that in the documentary, and that is extremely misleading, is the issue. Is that what you got out of it?
Yeah, that's what I got out of it. But what I mainly got out of it is the filmmakers were dishonest in their depiction of the situation. Discrediting the filmmakers was also indirectly discrediting people who took the filmmakers at face value, like me and you.
Anything that's going to be expert, in my opinion, would need to do a much more vigorous, comprehensive job.
I've been asking myself the question, how could I have been so, I almost want to say gullible,
to make anything that even reflects a comprehensive testimony, and then also one that precludes and excludes the idea of anything that looks like a lie of omission. When you don't talk about those facts in your testimony, I'm having difficulty understanding how you're not looking at the entirety of this encounter.
Oh, Lord.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, I've watched that so many times, it never gets less funny. Oh my gosh. To be completely clear, I'm not laughing at Lowry or McWhorter. They did exactly what any smart, good person should do. They found out they're probably wrong about something, they investigated, and they owned up to it when they found out they were incorrect. No, I was laughing, as I so often do, at J.C. Shea. Shea is clearly a smart person, but also a complete buffoon.
I don't think they're on the right side of history. I think they're on the wrong side of hypocrisy. Their own hypocrisy.
I've watched every interview I can find with this guy. He has a PhD. He constantly brags about all the empirical evidence he's reviewed.
Empirical evidence that resembled an empirical fact. Another fact that I would defy anyone to empirically debunk, if you will, that's not a conspiracy theory. It's empirical evidence. The empirical and irrefutable evidence and the facts, there are empirical facts to consider.
And loves taking subtle shots at his critics because he's too scared to actually confront people directly.
The Star Tribune even employs a current reporter, and I'm using air quotes not to be cute, but to show contempt.
Thanks for the clarification there, Dr. Shea. Us non-PhD holders have a hard time keeping up with your cutting insults. He has this aggressive, catty energy in his interviews with Liz Collin, but other than that one catastrophic incident with Dr. Lowry and Dr. McWhorter, he's never engaged in any sort of critical conversation about the Fall of Minneapolis, which is a surprise considering his enthusiasm for empirical evidence and portraying himself as a warrior for the truth, uncovering the untold story of Derek Chauvin. Because I, like Dr. Shea, am a huge fan of irony.
I'm a huge fan of irony.
I find his obvious insecurity about the weakness of his ideas strangely compelling. You know, like watching a car wreck or a collapsing house. You shouldn't feel too bad for him, though. He's got a real mean streak. Not only does he openly brag about deliberately excluding footage of George Floyd's murder from the Fall of Minneapolis.
When you depict the knee on the shoulder/neck, you don't show the 8 minutes and 36 seconds of it or whatever. You show only a snippet of that and give the impression to the uninformed viewer that what happened there was less traumatic than what actually happened. So I wanted to ask you about the editorial decision of how you actually depicted the restraint, the MRT restraint.
So if I may to that, and I'm the one who quite adamantly made this decision as the director. Well, supposedly, we've learned absolutely everything we need to know about this case from a viral Facebook video. The whole world has seen it. So why are we going to waste everyone's time and putting another 8, 9, 10 minutes of that in our documentary? It was to make this very subtle, understated contrast. And it was also a way of encouraging others, go look at the body cam video for yourselves. Watch it in its entirety. That was a very deliberate, strategic media move made on mostly me, adamantly, saying, let's cut it off here. Let's be deliberate. Hopefully this will prompt others to go see the videos for themselves.
I think the real reason you excluded the footage of George Floyd's murder was probably because watching it makes your arguments impossible to take seriously. I mean, you can try to laugh it off all you want, not that this is a very funny situation in any way, but the reality is we have footage of the murder that's very valuable evidence, and you can't just discount it because you've decided enough people have seen that part. You know, someone who really wants to get to the truth here would look at everything, not just what you think hasn't been paid enough attention. He's being weird during the lawsuit, too. His affidavit includes a bizarre section detailing all the personal information they supposedly uncovered about Blackwell. Several of the former and current Minneapolis police officers we interviewed commonly told us embarrassing stories and anecdotes regarding Blackwell and her personal life. For the sake of decorum, I will not repeat that information here. This reads like a thinly veiled threat, implying that if Blackwell doesn't back down on her lawsuit, these embarrassing stories might find their way into the public eye. He even congratulates himself for not publishing these stories, saying, if anything, Colin and I helped Blackwell maintain her credibility since we did not report or publish any of the embarrassing personal information about her. Frankly, if I may, I believe Blackwell should be thanking us, not suing us, especially since nothing has prevented us from publishing this information other than our focus and sense of fairness. I mean, do you see why this guy fascinates me? What kind of person says something like this in a legal document when you're being accused of defamation? Oh my God. You know, now you've seen how they portrayed Blackwell, so do you think she should be thanking Colin and Shay? Very classy, JC. You seem like a really stand-up guy. He's in good company with his new lawyer. Current Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara wrote an excellent op-ed in the Minnesota Star-Tribune defending Blackwell while maintaining a charitable and straightforward tone. The attorney representing Colin and Shay for Blackwell's lawsuit wrote a response op-ed for Alpha News, where he says to Brian O'Hara, "While rank-and-file police officers were searching for the crime spree suspects and trying to protect us, you enjoyed a long lunch at the Minneapolis club. Yes, Chief, I know where you eat, and I know who you talk to." It feels like mobster cosplay. It's just very strange, and I don't know why, they're both weirdly threatening the leadership of the Minneapolis Police Department. Colin is thankfully not directing any seemingly threatening language toward the Minneapolis Police Department leadership, but she's more motivated, I think, at least in part, by a personal vendetta against the Black Lives Matter movement. Something important to know about Colin is that she's married to a man named Bob Kroll. He was the president of the Minneapolis Police Department Union at the time of George Floyd's murder. I won't get too deep into Bob's problems. Let's just say I certainly wouldn't want to have his Wikipedia page. That's a long list of allegations of discriminatory conduct and excessive force. He's also, because of a lawsuit settlement, currently banned from serving as a police officer in Minnesota's most populous counties. After George Floyd's murder, Colin's marriage to Kroll prompted calls for her to be fired from her then job as a WCCO reporter. According to her book, she received a death and bomb threat in the mail, sent to the home she shared with her 7-year-old son. Soon after the threat, protesters gathered outside of her house, carrying piñata effigies of Kroll and Colin, which they proceeded to bash and demolish with sticks. Now, I don't like Liz Collin, you might have picked that up, but death and bomb threats are obviously never acceptable for anybody, and for what it's worth, I personally dislike the threatening tactics of the protesters who went to Colin and Kroll's home. At the time, Kroll obviously deserved public condemnation, but I don't think Liz Collin, at that point, had ever done anything other than be a news anchor married to a bad dude. Even if she had, even though Kroll is terrible, going to their house, destroying their likeness seems like a malicious, threatening, intimidating exercise to me. I don't like it. But that's what makes Colin's actions now reflect so poorly on her character. She's willing to accuse Blackwell of perjury to millions of people, knowing the possibility that Blackwell could face the same kind of terrifying treatment Colin herself once endured. In her affidavit, Blackwell says, "The shame and fear of being attacked or having one of my family members attacked, not only physically but on social media platforms with a state and national following, is immense. Every strange vehicle that drives by my home triggers some type of fear or concern of being somebody casing my home to possibly do further harm to me or my family. If anyone should understand that fear and hesitate before weaponizing public opinion against others, it's Colin. Instead, she chose to smear Blackwell as a liar, one who committed perjury to falsely imprison a fellow officer, in a documentary watched by millions of people. It makes me sad. You might say, why would you make this video? Every smart person already knows that the Fall of Minneapolis is garbage, but I don't think so. If there's anything I've learned from the past few years, it's that I shouldn't assume people will see things my way, especially when they're being actively deceived by organizations like Alpha News. Assuming the truth is obvious is what allows lies to flourish. I know so many people personally who I respect and care about, mostly from my small hometown, who fell for everything in this film, and maybe that's why I care about taking its arguments seriously. But I also hope that I can make analysis like this into engaging content on its own. Social media, of course, rewards the most shocking, emotionally charged content, which is why the Fall of Minneapolis spread so easily. But the way Alpha News lied is just as shocking, maybe even more so. Maybe exposing them can be just as engaging as the lies themselves were. I hope so. And no, Alpha News fans, I'm not getting paid. Nobody asked me to do this. I'm not a Democratic operative. My YouTube channel isn't even monetized yet. And I'm not Jewish either. Glad to see Alpha News' audience is about as classy as their creators are. I don't expect to change the discourse here, and while I'd like Alpha News to lose its monopoly over detailed coverage of this story, I don't expect that to change either. I just wanted this information to be here for anyone who's looking, and if that's you, thank you for caring and for watching. You should subscribe. You'll probably like the videos I hope to make soon. Really quick, I'd like to thank some people who have never heard of me, except for one, and describe how I learned about the Chauvin trial and how you can as well. After watching The Fall of Minneapolis for the first time about a year and a half ago, I decided to learn about the Chauvin trial the only way that made sense, by watching it. However, I wish I had found Matt Orchard's video first. His 2-hour breakdown of George Floyd's murder and the key moments from Chauvin's trial is one of the most thorough and fair explanations you'll find. If you do plan to watch full testimonies from the trial, I recommend using the Law and Crime YouTube channel, as they always place the exhibits visible in the courtroom on the screen. However, if you're pressed for time and don't want to watch the entire thing, Matt Orchard's video is a great place to start. Dina Winter, writing for the Minnesota Reformer, wrote an article called "I Watched the Fall of Minneapolis So You Don't Have to." Winter actually covered the trial as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and her clear and quick explanations of everything Alpha News ignored in the Fall of Minneapolis made me want to dig deeper and write my own article and make my first video. It's great, you should check it out. Bradley Balco wrote a 3-part series dissecting the Fall of Minneapolis. He released his first article right after mine, and as I mentioned before, he even used my video as a reference. Thank you for the kind words, Mr. Balco. I appreciate it. You cannot imagine how delightful it was to see a journalist with real expertise and connections take this film apart right after I had done the same thing, or tried to. I recommend everybody read all of these articles, of course, and subscribe to his Substack. You can do a free or paid subscription. I've been a paid subscriber ever since I discovered these articles, and I do not regret that purchase at all. Links to all of these resources are at the end of my Substack article. I make a lot of my videos into Substack articles just for people who like to read and to put all my sources and links, so go to the end of the article if you want to access any of this. Those few resources should be plenty to get you started if you'd like to learn more about this topic. Of course, you can watch my old video and all the new videos I hope to make about this subject as well. If there's anyone still watching at this point, you should definitely subscribe. There's a donation link as well. I decided to make a Buy Me a Coffee account because I don't make videos regularly enough to make a Patreon yet. But if you want to see more videos from me, it'll be a lot easier to dedicate so much of my free time to making these if I get some kind of financial support for them. So if you want to see more, please donate. Like and subscribe. If you can't donate, that's totally fine. Liking and subscribing will help my channel grow, and that'll make this a lot easier as well. So again, thank you. Now the video is over. Goodbye.